So, well, we've got a lot of time for kicking this stuff around. Does anyone have any burning questions that they want to start with? I've got one, but if anybody wants to go first. Okay, well, I'm going to start with my one. Okay, so it's a question to both of you, and it is about chapter 8, because there's an awful lot in chapter 8. It's both very deeply theoretical, and there's some lovely stuff about Popper, and there's some it really extends the epistemological themes of the book. But then there's a lot of technical stuff. There's the equations that Lota's taken from Daniel Dubois. There are computer programs where he's actually tested the theory of anticipation with some actual data. So all of that stuff about the pictures, which get jumbled up and then get reconstructed, this is presented as a demonstration of the mechanism that he's talking about. Now, I think my question is, I suspect in the group of people that come to these sessions and they were asked to comment on the contents of chapter 8, I suspect that their commentary would reflect the themes that you've been talking about, which are largely epistemological for both of you. Why don't we talk about the technical stuff? Do we think it's not important?
Andrea, would you like to say? All right. If I may give an answer, I think there are two acts. One is you make the distinctions and then you do something with the distinctions. And what George Spencer Brown, as I get to know him, and I should say, a year ago I was very critical of him. So it's really by going back and reading him again. Actually, it's only 3-4 months ago I really changed my thinking. He's pointing out there is a step that's called making a distinction, and we somehow have skipped that step, and we have no excuse for skipping it, because Husserl already was trying to tell us the mind makes distinctions. So why? So then George Spencer Brown is repeating it, but the community is very divided about whether he made a contribution or not. I mean, some people think, but other people totally dismiss it. And that was 60 years ago. And so apparently, what you're voicing is still this idea that this is trivial to talk about how we make distinctions. Well, that makes all the difference. Because once you start with trivializing distinctions, there is no way of communicating with anyone, and we have exactly what Klaus calls that we just say, I understand, but we don't understand at all. We just want to terminate the conversation.
Yeah, okay. So what do you see as trivializing distinctions, Jamie?
Trivializing is, well, we tell me, okay, all right. My definition at the moment is when I open a textbook on the philosophy of logic, that's somewhere in the middle, a chapter on distinctions, and then it say pragmatic, syntax, and semantic, the three distinctions. But it immediately jumps into logic is about inferential thinking and syllogisms. And so then it goes, and depending on the book, it says that's the way the mind works. But it never says the mind comes out of the womb making distinctions, and it needs to learn to update how it thinks of itself and as a distinction making being. And we see that at work in the text of George Spencer Brown. Now, I'm not saying that he's perfect or that he's a god or whatever. I mean, there are things I have a trouble with in his work, but at least he says it starts with the mind making distinctions.
Okay.
And so I challenge you to give me other texts outside psychoanalysis, because in psychoanalysis this reasoning is explored, but outside psychoanalysis that say a human, a Neanderthaler, I call it. I mean, to make us really think about, if we take biology serious, I mean, we need to think about how the Neanderthalers were making distinctions.
Yeah.
And how that made civilization possible. And I don't see a lot of literature that's encouraging us to do this exercise.
Okay. Can I ask the same question to Andrea then? Because I mean, again, it's yeah. I mean, there's a lot in chapter 8, isn't there? And we're sort of talking around half of it, I suppose.
Okay. Excuse me, is it a question to me? I couldn't hear well. Sorry.
Yes.
Excuse me, what is the question?
That there is a lot in chapter 8, and that our discussion tends to focus on the epistemological aspects.
Yes, I agree. Yes, it was my focus, epistemological one. Okay, and because of course we know that. Okay, so you want me to dig deeper in the epistemological dimension?
Well, I think reflect on the extent to which we are talking about epistemology when there's quite a lot of mathematics. There's quite a lot of empirical stuff in the chapter.
Yes, there is. I agree with you, but my focus was on epistemology basically for two reasons. For the first reason is the great importance focuses on devoted to Karl Popper's definition of World 3, which is, I think, is a pillar of the chapter. The second aspect I didn't want to cope with in my epistemological presentation is that on the technical side, for example, when you're thinking about drawing distinctions and about also Spencer Brown's thinking in the way Luhmann interprets Spencer Brown's, the first question I wondered about to myself.
Just give it a second. I'm sure Andreas will be with us in a second.
Okay, sorry, there was an interruption. I'll be fast. When I was wondering about the mathematical part of the chapter, for example, but it would have been very long in a debate and in a 15-minute presentation, so I skipped it. Epistemologically, the matter is if the distinction between hyper-incursive, incursive, and recursive equations are differences which make the difference.
Yes, that's right.
And as all of them are first level differential equations, the outcome of the equations seems quite different, but epistemologically, I don't know if the terms in the syntax, quoting also Umberto Eco, and the structure of the epistemological general design of the research, the difference.
I can cut this bit out when we edit it. I can cut it out. Hello, Andrea.
Okay, it's different among hyper sorry for the interruption. Again, it's not my will and not fault.
I understand.
Not yours, of course, either. Hyper-incursive, incursive, and recursive is a difference which really makes the difference. But I think we could write a book about it. So in a 15 minutes presentations, I prefer to skip this aspect.
Okay, but
So
can I ask,
epistemological.
can I ask both of you then, what do you think Loth is trying to achieve in this chapter particularly, because it has got these two dimensions? This, you know, we've had the sort of very practical Shannon equations of economic activity in earlier chapters, but this is where we get a theory of anticipation being explained both from a theoretical point of view, Andrea's gone again, but being explained from a theoretical point of view and from a practical computational point of view. What's this really driving at?
Okay, I will give an example if I got the question correctly, if I got the point correctly. Among the quotations I selected from Loth's chapter, there is a nice one in which he states, I'm reading now, the focus in this chapter has been on how an evolving system of expectations can be simulated without an a priori sociological interpretation. I argue in favor of operationalization and measurement.
Yes.
I think this is the core of the author, the core of the chapter, according to the author.
Yeah.
But as far, maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. But of course, Umberto Eco taught us there are the intensio autoris, intensio operis, and intensio selectoris. So there is the intention of the author, the intention of the work itself, and the intention of the reader. So of course I can try to give an interpretation of Loth's work, but I'm not Loth.
No, I understand.
So as far as I can try to put his shoes, my shoe size is different, for better and for worse. So as far as I could understand, the focus in this chapter has been on how an evolving system of expectations can be simulated without an a priori sociological interpretation. I argue in favor of operationalization and measurement. I give you a quick example. It's not an example by Loth, it's an example of mine. So forgive me, it's maybe a bit provocative or maybe, you know, not consistent with the chapter, but I mean, we are trying to deal with the thought of our beloved Loth. And when I think about the horizons of expectations, also thinking in terms of the word taken for granted by Berger and Luckman, I can simply think about the ecological debate everybody today is involved in. Both people, both organizations, both political parties who state that there is an ecological disaster, there is a climate change which is going to impact on our lives very dramatically and so forth. And people will say, I don't care, it's not true, it's just conspiracy. So the two extremes, they are both talking about horizons of expectations. They are not talking about reality.
Okay, yeah.
Because so they move on the horizon of the future, the horizon of expectations. So they might be wrong, they might be right, but there is no way in this moment to say empirically who's right and who's wrong, for the very basic reason that that the future has no data. Data belongs to the construction of the past. And then you can try to foresee, forecast, or foresight, but you have no data about the future. That's why epistemology is more important than empirical research from my point of view in this case.
Okay, all right. This is. I think this is extremely interesting. Right, Jerome, you've had your hand up for ages.
So can I perhaps respond to Andrea, because and also to your question, and then of course I want to listen to what Jerome's comment is. There is a huge disconnect in this chapter, and that is, I think, what Andrea is pointing out, and that is the failure, not paying attention to the distinction. This between before anticipation, there is imagination and fantasy life, and that is totally ignored how the fantasy life of human beings is being stimulated, and the directions it makes them go. And what I also find a little bit shocking in the chapter is discursive knowledge is about books. And so books, we write and design them, and now we read and use them. And there is no discussion in the chapter of what is happening. The fact that we actually need to read the book to do something with it, and that we need to write the book. And so that's totally ignored. And instead, there is this abstract talk about Shannon's theory of communication. And Shannon clearly said he wasn't talking about reading and writing, he was talking about telephones communicating with one another. So what I see in chapter 6, chapter 8, is all these abstract words, and now we have the practice of the distinction between the spoken and the written word, which is not at all clear in Lude's stick figure, whether it's the written word or the spoken, or whether it's the unspoken thought. So there's no attention to the reading and the writing, and the fact that the human brain, as Tobias was alluding, when we speak, listen, read, or write, we deal with distinctions in a very different manner. So there is no, as far as I'm concerned, there's no touching on the empirical reality. Instead, it is some fantasy reality where there are all these mathematical equations running around, but there is no effort to connect it with reality. And I'm setting here it up as a lexicon. If Lude had given me a lexicon where every one of these terms was translated in something that very clearly say, now I'm talking about reading, now I'm talking about the university that's doing a good or a bad job to teach what's involved with reading. If he had given a lexicon, then I could do something with the mathematical equations, but he hasn't done it. So that's the reason I'm not talking about them.
So, I mean, basically your answer to my question is you say it doesn't add up, and that's why the sort of focus is falling on the epistemology.
That's nicely summarized.
Okay, all right, Jerome.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. We're all having crazy internet days today.
Well, I'm in a cafe here in Berlin, so it says Frankfurt. I'm actually in Berlin. So I'm not sure how good my internet here is. And I did not hear Andrea's presentation, unfortunately, or only the last few sentences. So I will mainly react to Margareta's. Although I found what Andrea just said, his last comments quite interesting, and they reminded me, just in an aside, of a conversation I was having with my own partner, who is head of human resources in a company, so has some sort of practical experience talking about cultural differences, working for a Japanese company. And he, when I was explaining this chapter to him, actually was saying, well, this sounds like a very Japanese way of thinking. Anyway, so that's just sort of an aside on that, and maybe we can talk about that. Or maybe I can invite my partner to sort of tell his opinion. But okay, so to my comments, I was following you, Jamie or Margareta, as you were talking about this snake tail perspective and the seismogenesis, the dangers of sort of unconstrained positive feedback, that the academy is adumbrated in that or is implicated in that. However, I did not so much follow you as your comments became more, I guess, reflective of the contents of chapter 8. I'm not sure, in short, to what extent what you're saying actually reflects what's chapter 8. So you say that there's a combination of Papa and then something computational, you say there. To what extent is that the case? I'm not sure I see it. You also talk about the need for a friendly discourse rather than a critical discourse. I think these are rather sloppy terms. I'm not very fond of, looking at things like good or evil, or, it's nice, or, you see where I'm getting to. I think that, one could be friendly and critical, or to what extent is being friendly necessary to lead a productive, intellectual debate? That's questionable. So to what extent are these mutually exclusive categories? So following that, to what extent is it a useful distinction, as you say? Also, which metaphors are you referring to? And as far as you say, not making the distinction, I have the sense, actually, from my background, that there are plenty of distinctions made in this chapter, particularly, in particular. Well, in reference to what Andrea just mentioned, the distinction between the recursive, incursive, and hyper-recursive notions. Certainly, those are quite formal terms, but if we look at the arrow of history pointing in one direction and pointing in the other, and the distinctions that entails due to our limited knowledge of the fourth dimension, we're moving in one direction. So thinking in either direction makes a difference. So yes, I think that there's a little bit of a tendency of late here in the group to pile on Lut and accuse him of things that I don't think are quite fair. So I was thinking of the picture of Atlas, Atlas, the Greek mythological figure who's carrying the world. We are not Atlas. Lut is not Atlas. I'm not Atlas, and none of you are. We all have, a certain perspective, a certain background, a certain training, and are looking at the world from that lens. And I do think that Lut, in his heart, is open to a interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary dialogue. I find his contributions very meaningful. Whether his approach, applying this sort of derivation of Shannon's theory of information, is the right approach, we can debate about that. But I do, honor him, or but I have some respect for, this attempt, this perspective. So I would appreciate a little bit less sort of piling on, you forgot to do this, you forgot to do that. And so I think that there is a lot to be said of this perspective that he brings in from Husserl, this notion of intersubjectivity. So I do find some of these criticisms a bit off base. That's my comment.
Thanks, Jerome. I think one of the things about doing a close reading like this is that it's good to actually focus on what we're reading. It's very tempting to sort of talk about what we'd like to have read, which perhaps reflected what we wanted to say, but we have to go back to the text. And I do think, I think this chapter is hugely ambitious, which I really like. Whether it's right, I don't think it's a matter of whether it's being right, but it's joining together things which are not often connected in this way, particularly the philosophy and actually computation. Jamie, can I ask you, because you said something about the Lot being caught in a double bind. I wonder, a double bind is a very specific thing. Where do you see the binding? Where do you see the contradiction and the prevention of people actually talking about the bind that they're in? Jamie?
Where is she? Jamie?
Really, it's like some sort of Jamie, you're muted.
Unmute myself. All right.
All right.
Now you're back.
Are I in the right slide or in the wrong slide? Yeah.
Well, I'm seeing thank you on the screen.
Yeah, then I'm in the wrong slide, and I'm going to give it again. So there is a talk about objective knowledge, and it can be understood as a book. And so a book is something that we read. And when we read, we use a metaphor. and we have a choice among 5 different metaphors to argue. And the very popular one is the war metaphor, and Jerome is problematizing it. And that's exactly what I'm doing. I say, if we don't talk about metaphors, then everyone is going to think we're at war with each other and we can't really criticize. And we cannot have the good productive discussion. And we really need to talk about our metaphors to stop going in the Ouroboros circle of accusing each other of piling up and not respecting. And I'm trying to give Flute a lot of credit. I mean, that's the reason I'm organizing the book reading with you, Mark. But there is still the double bind for me is to celebrate the computer metaphor or the computational metaphor, while at the same time pointing out that we need another metaphor that needs to be at the same level as the computational metaphor. And that other metaphor will allow us to talk about how are we arguing. Do we really need to use the war metaphor? Can we find another one? What do we do? What do we need to do to stop taking it all personal? Because there is another quote that I didn't use where Lou talks about the distinction between objective and subjective knowledge. And it's at the subjective level that we take it personal. And if we keep that separate from the objective, then the problem is less.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that the specifics of the double bind though would be, I mean, as I'm picking up from what you're saying, that on the one hand there's a computational metaphor, as you put it, and then there's a let's put it an epistemological, and you're saying that they're in conflict with each other, which I can understand. And those communications at different orders, different levels. But the only thing about the double bind is that Bateson's very clear that there is an injunction to say that you can't step out, you can't actually describe the dynamics that you're in. And I cannot see that there is any such injunction in Loth. In fact, there is an invitation to step into these dynamics and to see that actually there are these different descriptions. And yes, they do get along rather badly sometimes, but actually we need to be able to find our way through these things. So I think I would say it was the opposite of a double bind.
Actually. Okay, if you say it like this, then my question to you is, where is the lexicon where the translation is between the epistemological part and the computational part? Because that is where the invitation is supposed to be, so that it allows you to switch and see how to move from one metaphor to the other. And I don't see it. If he had explained how hyper-recursive, and I gave you the list of all the difficult words. If there had been a lexicon to say this is what it means from the angle of reading, this is how it connects to writing, this is why we have a department in hermeneutics. He's very close, okay? He's very close because he says a lot of those things, but he never says here is the lexicon. That's what I mean.
Okay, I think
but can I just ask, what do you mean, Jamie, by, excuse me for interrupting, but what do you mean by computational? So I'm just curious, what is the distinction for you, Margareta, between the epistemological view, you know, how do we know what we know, and the computational view? So how do you define this distinction?
I can define it if you wish.
Go on, Jerry.
Well, I'm actually curious to hear how Jamie is making this distinction, because it's important to understand what she's saying.
Let her give her distinction and then I'll give mine.
All right.
Okay. There is a book by Stephen Pepper, the title World Hypothesis, and he sets up the human mind as switching among different root metaphors. And so the computational metaphor is where we think like calculators, and we compute. The word is computing, and now we have actually computers to actually have a model. And Gottfried Leibniz was the first one who kind of came up with this idea of people talking in numbers, and that the higher number was the better one. And so now another root metaphor is to think of humans as classifiers. Because they have a filing cabinet and everything needs to be classified. And Thomas Kuhn discusses just how these metaphors are at work in his book. And then a fourth metaphor is the puzzlers. This where we have all the pieces in the puzzle that we try to put together, like what Mark was doing, is the mathematical piece with the epistemological piece. And now we have the gestalt switchers, or the dramaturgical metaphor, so to say, that that actually have a long tradition, but we just need to pay attention to it. That kind of focuses on the gestalt, or difference, or life is theater. Erwin Goffman is a sociologist who worked on it, but Bertolt Brecht did some innovative work in the theater to point it out. And then in the research on creativity, they call it the aha-erlebnis, a new gestalt has formed. So I'm pointing out different big frameworks, or root frameworks that can be used to compare and contrast. So we never step out of a framework, we actually switch among frameworks.
Jamie.
That was very useful. I am now curious, this is a follow-up question to you, Jamie, to what extent it may not actually be mutually exclusive, the view that Ruth is proposing. Say just, we take these three, recursive, incursive, hyper-incursive, whatever you call those perspectives, to what extent is this perspective, is there potential for isomorphism or similarity to the, say, the gestalt shifting view, or one of the other views that you just mentioned? To what extent is it necessary that this phrasing that Ruth uses is necessarily computational? I have the feeling, just to say, sort of reveal my thoughts, that you have a little bit of a math aversion. So to me, just because that somebody's using a function with a sub, what do you say, a sub, you know, a time indicator t, or t plus 1 minus 1, does not necessarily mean that somebody's computing. So this could just be, again, a symbol for, say, an imaginary thought that somebody's having, that, you know, it sort of incurs from the future, aliens. To me, it's, I mean, fill in the blank. So the question is, to what extent do you think it is an essential distinction between these various points of view, or to what extent can there be a shared epistemology or shared worldview?
Jamie, you're on mute again.
Yeah. Okay. So for those who think I have a math aversion, I have a background in engineering. So I like to think of myself more as someone who has been thinking about mathematics for 60 years. But you're welcome to think what you think, Jerome. But this is really about how are we talking about the unobservable, and what are metaphors doing in guiding that conversation. And the computational metaphor is one metaphor that is easy to grab and do things with. So it's attractive because it's easy, but does it help us understand difference? And that is what George Spencer Brown is talking about, and that is what Luth is also wanting to talk about, and that is what innovation research wants to talk about. And can we talk about innovation by focusing on identity? If we start by assuming everything is identical to itself, and by the way, that has nothing to do with computing, that's just a working hypothesis. And that working hypothesis can that help us get anywhere? And that is when we take the computational metaphor and we over-identify with it. So if that is helpful, I'm talking about over-identifying with the metaphor to the point that you think it is reality. I'm trying to say that's not a good idea. And how can we avoid it? By talking about the metaphors that we use and discuss both their positive and their negatives um, instead of making it an either or. It's both, none of the above or something. Andrea.
Well, Jerry was going to give his
Yeah.
computational thing, and then Andrea. Jerry?
Yeah. So let me take myself off video here. So I'm sorry, I had another Zoom meeting that I had to attend this morning. So I missed much of the conversation. But having said that, just picking up and restricting my comments to Jerome's particular comments, because he seems, or as I understand his expression, he places great confidence in the value of, how should we say, using mathematical terminology in a way that is used as guidance for how to visualize or to fantasize about various issues that are at hand. And this, I think there's a limitation here that is very strong when one wishes to use mathematics to express very complicated or difficult concepts or things that are, shall we say, high dimensional inputs and outputs from a systems point of view. And I would say here then that I personally use the method developed by Aristotle, which starts with, if you want to use mathematics, first you do an analysis of the system, and then you use your analysis and the lexicon that you developed in the analysis to do the synthesis. And this is how you construct propositions appropriately, is in that context. So in the case of information theory and Shannon's work, and particularly in Lutz's usage of mathematics, I think you have to understand that when you do an analysis of a real system to get down to, if you would, something equivalent to information theory, which is basically Boolean algebra and the transmission of numbers as part of communication, so that that level of analysis removes all of the meaning from the symbols. So when you do the analysis, you get it down to numbers that you can transmit by and compute upon. Then you have removed all the attributes of the system and have gotten down to zeros and ones. If you're going to do synthesis from this point of view, you now have to reconstruct all the relationships among the numbers. And this problem of synthesis is where you are very, very constricted by what you can compute. Generally speaking, the general public believes that if you have some mathematical equations, you can compute anything. Well, that's not the case at all. Computation is a very, very limited form of the use of mathematics. It's extremely limited in what you can compute, but this is not general knowledge, all right? And it's well known within the computer science community. They have a whole vast array of terminologies, of lexicons, of what you can compute and what you cannot compute. Now, certainly in the case of Jerome's usage of the word isomorphism, that is almost a meaningless term from a mathematical point of view. it does tell you that you have the same forms, but that's not, most women have similar forms. Does that tell you how to compute something about a woman? I don't think so.
I think there's probably some computer scientists that believe it, but yes.
Right. So that's really all I wanted to say, is that when we want to introduce mathematical terms in the sense that Lute is seeking to introduce them, and I would say I've followed his work now for 15 or 20 years, and I've also followed the work of Dubois, who's a personal acquaintance and colleague of mine, for the same length of time. And this use of mathematics is it's very useful in its own domain, but it has very severe limitations of what you can conclude about it, or what sort of metaphors you can build from it.
Okay.
And
all right.
that's basically all I want to say.
Okay.
Andrea,
Andrea, thank you for being patient.
No problem. My pleasure. May I say something?
Mm.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think they were very stimulating discussions. Some of them, maybe very interesting and also wide, and maybe a little far away from chapter 8 we are debating. I think that the matter of the double bind is something which should be clarified better, not just by Jamie, but in general, also in Lute's book, because Lutz, at the very beginning of the book, not in chapter 8, states as pillars of his own work three sources: Niklas Luhmann, systemic theory; Shannon and Weaver, mathematical theory of information; and the anticipatory system theory. As far as I know, especially in Luhmann's case, none of them is based on the double bind.
No.
Especially Luhmann. Luhmann is very clear in the distinction between a system and environment. There is no double bind in Luhmann's work. It's a self-referential selection of meaning from an outer, noisy Umwelt, to use a German word, a kind of outer environment. Also in von Förster's observing system, we have the definition that the environment is what it is, because as far as you cannot select noise among noise, but just distinguish noise from communication and communication from noise, when you are in the middle of the noise, you just get noise. So there is no way, according to Luhmann's self-referential concept of complexity systems, to have a double bind. There is no way. So my point is that your stimulations were very, very important, very good elicitations. But if we are debating Lutz's book in general and chapter 8 in particular, also in the terms of founding what Lutz calls the discursive knowledge, I think it's a matter of self-reference, which is not a bad thing. Just a matter of self-reference, not a matter of double bind. That was my comment.
Okay. All right.
So
can I respond to Jerry, because he did address me in his comments? Just to say, in anticipation, I am not a fan of math at all. In fact, I mean, I have a training as an economist, and I've always been very critical of the physics envy and the math fetish that many economists, particularly macroeconomists, have. And I think it is actually in this regard, and given my training, that I find Lutz's contributions very useful, because economists generally, they have a econometric approach. They crunch some numbers, they put some data, mainly referring again to the past. We're all referring to the past, as Andrea said, you have data from the past, but you don't have data from the future. That's impossible. And so this approach that Lutz has with these, I guess you could call them functions, are, and again, and for me, an epistemological tool to explain to economists who might be still living in the Stone Age that in fact it may be important to take a perspective lodged in, again, the introjection of, future anticipation into a system in order to represent the dynamic processes that are ongoing. And to this extent, you can have notions like Bertolt Brecht's notion of Entfremdung, alienation, the effect that his theater, the Caucasian talk circle, whatever you have, has on an audience as an event, a process that is again incurring on the minds of people. They leave the theater changed. So you have a Gestalt shift in a sense. This can be part of an anticipatory system that is incurring on the present on the basis of anticipations of the future by some artist or author. Again, this is my question. And I said isomorphism or similarity. I wasn't, fetishizing any particular term. So in that sense, I think that the question at this point is, to what extent are there real differences of views among this group, or to what extent are we just sort of talking past each other?
That's a very important question, and I think well, that's the value of actually having a focus, which is this book, and for us then to talk about our understanding of this book, because we will all have different understandings of it in different ways, I guess. Jamie?
Yes. Yes, so it's interesting that Jerome ends with the word identity and difference, because it's exactly about how to work with difference without being threatened by the difference. And the identity, the desire for identity as kind of corrupted our engagement with difference, to say it in that way. Now, in response to Andrea, I was trying to get a quote from a book, Lynn Segal, 1986, second edition in 2001, The Dream of Reality, Heinz von Fürster's Constructivism. I don't know how recently all of you have read the book, but there George Bateson is quoted as saying scientists are crazy. So, and then of course Lynn had to go and ask George Bateson what he meant by that and what the double entendre was. And so he kind of set up the snake eating its tail, so that there was always a slipping away from exactly what it was that was being said. So I use deliberately the word double bind, not to say that Lud was using the concept or that von Fuster was using. I was just telling they were creating for us, for the outsiders, a double bind. And I use that snake as an example, the whole idea of circular causality, by the double bind, as I understand it in family therapy, is that you say one thing to the child and then your actions imply something else. And that Bateson's idea was that it was creating schizophrenia. And now, interesting, the French psychoanalysts have played with this idea further. And so that's exactly just what I'm saying, that Lud, I'm not accusing Lud, I'm just saying the way the book is constructing, has he really thought about the two conflicting messages, and the two conflicting messages are the privileging of the computational metaphor, as opposed to saying we need to talk more about metaphors. And for me the example was just the lack of a lexicon, but Lud is caught in the middle of a larger discussion in society about how to work with metaphors. And I should, as long as we don't have a lexicon, we will have trouble communicating. And so I think George Spencer Brown is helping us explain the steps involved in creating a lexicon. That is, pay attention to the distinctions, listen to the distinctions, think about your own one's own distinctions, clarify distinctions, and so yeah. So I conclude my comment for now.
Okay, and Andrea?
Yes, very quickly. What I'm saying is that I understand Jamie's work and I appreciate her contribution. She was very stimulating, so I'm not opposing to what she's saying. I'm just saying that working on Luhmann's complex system self-referential theory and working on Bateson's concept of double bind are two different paradigms or paradigms, I don't know how you pronounce it, which exclude one and the other. It's Lutz's book. My impression is that in his book, the way he's following is much more Luhmann's oriented than Bateson's oriented. So if we talk in general about double bind, I can accept all different perspectives because we are aware we are talking about different systemic paradigms. But if we are introducing a kind of double bind approach in Lutz's book, it's a different story.
Yeah.
I don't know if I am clear.
No, I completely agree. And I think one of the the key thing about the Luhmann approach is that it's trans-individual. So you know, Luhmann isn't, well, famously less interested in the individual than he is in the communication system. Bateson tends to be sort of focused on agency. It tends to be focused on the individual in some way. You know, that isn't the way that Logan.
Exactly. If you can.
Yes, and I actually had a slide in which I was pointing out that there are two different, or maybe more than two, streams in cybernetics, and that it is helpful to be aware of them. And again, that for me gets back to the importance of the lexicons. And I started my presentation by pointing out the Bateson concept of the runaway positive feedback circle, because I think it's a nice neutral way of describing what's happening in society. And I understand it to mean that we need those lexicons. We cannot just say we don't need them, because it's...
Can you just explain what you mean, Jamie? Because, I mean, the thing that springs to my mind is that there's an awful lot of talk in the book about codes of communication. Is a lexicon a code of communication?
A lexicon, insofar that I understand it, is literally a dictionary outside of any, whether it's Luhmann cybernetics or Bateson. It's just a list of the terms using distinctions. It's okay. Another way is think of it as a filing cabinet where you kind of say this is what is in this drawer, this is what in this folder, and so you kind of give a list. What I see in Lutz's work, he's already inside a way of thinking that sounds like it's transhuman. Was that a term you used?
Transpersonal.
Trans-individual.
Trans-individual.
So he's thinking at the trans-individual level, and I don't think he's asking the question, is that the way how society works? Is that, do people make all decisions? Actually, maybe he does, but if he does, I 100% disagree. I think humans are making decisions, and and they do it as Bateson says. Dus they're in these feedback loops, positive, negative, and the loops, the going back and forward, is what leads to a decision. But it is by looking at the human brain, so to say, and how the different parts work together, and not at some trance level.
Okay. I would just say, Andrea and Jerome are waiting to speak, but maybe your lexicon would actually operate as a code of communication. It's a way of coordinating expectations. I would suggest that's what that would amount to.
That is 100% true, but I don't think of myself as thinking of Shannon model of communication. I use more the Carl Bühler model that says the meaning is created inside my head, your head, Jerome's head, Jerry's head. Who else is there? Lucas's head.
We've all got heads. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you go inside the head.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
then you simplify it and present it as a model.
All right.
The head.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Andrea, and then Jerome.
Thank you again. Okay, I understand the importance of the lexicon, and I agree about it. A shared lexicon implies I wouldn't say just one paradigm, but at least a very neat clarification among different systemic paradigms. For example, I will be brief. In the WCSA conference I chaired in Lisbon last month, we debated about Leutz's book, and we also awarded for his lifetime career success Edgar Morin, who came in person virtually by Zoom, giving a speech. And I'm perfectly aware that when Leutz says system is not what Edgar Morin means by system. So it's my opinion, at least, from the systemic paradigm, the first two. If it is the whole part paradigm, if it is if it is an autopoietic focused paradigm, I can imagine among the 3 or 4 systemic paradigms, no more than that. So we can have a successful if we agree about the paradigms. That's why epistemology once again wins on one side, because you can shape lexicon without shaping the paradigm. This data changes according to the paradigm, changes according to the different paradigm.
Okay.
Luhmann, you don't have transpersonal communication. Human beings are not in the system. Human beings produce noise. They communicate one to the other, each other, but their communication never becomes systemic. That's why emergency in system is possible, but is statistically unlikely. Our huge amount of noise, you get 3 meaningful communications. And if you consider Luhmann's most important interlocutors in the UK, for example, Michael King and Christopher Thornhill, it's very clear that, for example, Michael King authored the book titled Communication and Not People Make Systems. And communication is an endless flow from paradigm to data through lexicon. So that's why I think the epistemological tendencies, Leutz's books, are more important than the empirical data and empirical mathematization of the book itself. But it's just my opinion, of course.
Okay. Jerome?
Yeah, that's an interesting, or I would say a legitimate point of view that Andrea just espoused. And again, other people I think are free to see things differently. And I think that's the really interesting thing about this book and this group of people that we have sort of gathered together to discuss it, because we all come from very, very different backgrounds, cultures, countries, parts of the world, time zones, and so on. So I find all these conversations quite fascinating, even if I bring some critical views sometimes. So to this last comment of Margareta's of the lexicon, I would say two things. In the first case, I would say that do it. That could be your contribution, Margareta or Jamie. And I would say in general that I would say in general that Lutz, the question is, what is his intent here? I don't think his intent was to create lexicon. So you cannot, accuse someone of failing to do something that they're not trying to do. So I think the question that motivated the book is that of, what is evolving? So I think of this quote that he keeps citing in the book where, the professor is crawling under the table and, he says, what is evolving? And Lutz is attempting to answer this question in terms of, culture. So this move from political economy, where he has the two governing logics, as he says, to, one that incorporates the communications view, and he has all these different, evolutionary biology, you have cybernetic system theory, phenomenology, and so on. All the stuff that is brought into the book. And I would say that instead of a lexicon, what we really need is something like I used when I learned English. My first language was German, and I read, bilingual books. So we need some kind of a bilingual or trilingual or etc. A way to apply the lessons, if Andrea's right, the epistemology that's presented in this book to different domains. How does this apply in the domain of on the biological level? How does it apply on the communications, on the cultural, on the economic, and so on, political levels? And so I think that's the job now for us. And I would just close with the reference that Klaus always makes. What is the hierarchy? How do we organize this system? And Andrea just mentioned autopoiesis. Is it self-organizing? Are we, to this extent, what agency are we capable of in this sense?
Okay, Jerry.
Yeah, Jerome, I think you're coming closer to what I would say is a rational approach to trying to understand what Lutz is talking about. But I think the difficulty here is captured by the concept of a lexicon as being the grounding for the system of logic that you choose to apply, so that a formal logical system necessarily requires a set of symbols and a logical system of thought that allows you to draw conclusions. And it is that path to the conclusions that depends on the lexicon. So if people start with different lexicons, they may have a very, very difficult time coming to the same conclusion. Although, in terms of Tarski, it's the conclusion that is important, and the path of how you get there is less important. So that part of it. Now, when you come to try and put these notions of analysis and synthesis, analysis to a lexicon and synthesis of a conclusion, it depends on how you select terms for your lexicon. And this is where the divergence of this group is fantastic, in the sense that the lexicon chosen by someone trained in economics more or less uses the metaphor, the physical terminology. People trained in biology are going to use more of a lexicon of chemistry. People trained in mathematics are going to use a lexicon of mathematical terminology. These are radically different lexicons, and searching for a common conclusion from the different lexicons is a challenging task.
It actually, Jerry, I wonder if it takes us back to Andrea's example, a lovely example about Nostradamus. And, you can imagine not just one Nostradamus. Let's say we got 100 Nostradamuses, each armed with a lexicon telling them what a skyscraper is, an airplane, television, what clothes are. How do they coordinate their understanding? How do they even reach an understanding of what those things are in the abstract? It surely must be a communication system. There must be some kind of coordination of their understanding their situation and some mechanism for coordinating it. I would have thought.
I could give you a very long response to that question of the consistency of correspondence between different lexicons. And the bottom line is that, I take that back. The opportunity for creative imaginations and creative fantasies of how things are related to one another is unbounded. I mean, it's the fantasy of the individual and their capacity to imagine how things fit together. That's, and perhaps the good example here is a very deep similarity between the lexicon of chemistry and the lexicon of music. And yet the ordinary person would see these things as very dramatically different, one being grounded in emotions and the other being grounded in abstract diagrams. I think that's approaching where the reality of living as a human being is.
Okay. Jamie?
Yes, I come to this all from strategic management, and there was one article published in a journal called The Unobservable. So the entire article was dedicated to explaining that managers, they just sit in their office or they're playing golf, they do nothing at all, yet they paid millions now. Why? Well, because they actually do a lot, but it's invisible. And it's not because it's invisible, it doesn't matter. It's actually very important, and they use metaphors. So that is the way I really got into this topic of metaphors, and I couldn't help but notice how I don't see really there's an effort to point out how to work with, or maybe it's there, but I haven't found a translation key yet. But so what I would like to do now is actually give a shout out to Jason, because Jerome made a comment, and actually I should know Jerome, and we know each other for like since 2009 or something. So he said, why don't you create a lexicon? The whole point of what I'm trying to say is you cannot just create a lexicon, and that's what Jerry was saying, is you need actually people working together to create a lexicon. And you cannot say you're in charge, like this discipline is in charge. No, we all need to work together. I mean, because no one is in charge. I mean, that's the whole point of self-organizing. It's like it's the give and take that kind of naturally arises. And now I mean, this is just some visual to actually point out that there is a huge literature on talking circles and all the difficulty of having roundtable discussions. And then I also would like to give a shout out to Jason and the club of Remy, because he basically started this discussion as a roundtable discussion like 2 years ago now. Dus that I kind of see as an attempt to set up this interdisciplinary thinking that is needed. And I would like to also do a shout out to Stuart Umpleby, who has been trying, I don't know for how many years, to alert Americans to the need to educate themselves on European philosophy, and that he says people listen politely and then they walk away. So they're not doing anything, and he is kind of making this argument also, this interdisciplinary thinking where we really listen. And as I understand it today, it's like the apartment building model of interdisciplinary research. Like each discipline has its own floor and they all set their own rules and they have their own organizations, but there is nothing that's trying to tell us how to work across disciplines. And so I want to do a shout out to Jason and Stuart Umpleby for creating a context to take us think interdisciplinary. And then, of course, Loot is giving us a beautiful book to practice thinking interdisciplinary.
Okay. I can't. Jerome, I think you're next.
It's a piano sonata. Well, I guess it has too many chapters for a piano sonata. Lute's book, I mean. No, I was using a metaphor. By the way, Jamie, just to respond very, very quickly, I did say do it. I did not use a pronoun, so I didn't necessarily imply you do it. I could have been we do it, or they do it, or someone else do it. Anyway, so I don't mean to nitpick. And I think you raised an interesting question there, Jamie, by the way, and also Jerry before that, which is the issue of, I guess we've called it here innovation, but you could also use the word initiative. And I think you do have certain, they could be processes, they could also be individuals, unique individuals, you know, in biology, you call them mutations, who then introduce new, whatever it is, events, processes into the world, whether it be Jason with the Club of Remy, whether it be, you know, Lute with his book, whether it be, you know, whatever, you know, many, actually, one particular example that I wanted to mention is also an article by, I think it's Kyriasis and Metaxas, two Greek, in this case, economists, who are studying the history or the development of democracy in Athens or in the Greek Dark Ages. And they use a term like, I think it's called macrocultures, on the basis of the hoplite warfare that also Max Weber talks about, which, you know, required citizens or individuals to defend themselves after the collapse of Mycenae. And you had this, you know, this dependency of the city of the polis on the, you know, farmers who were, you know, also the army, and they got a sense that in fact we need representation. We need also to participate in governing. And why am I defending my city without having a say? So this is being a motor to generate a sense of entitlement to participate. So that is being a motor for initiative, for innovation. And who is responsible? What is responsible? How do these processes start? And I think we have a great group here to discuss exactly these types of dynamics. I think they're very important.
Okay, I agree. Andrea, do you have your hand up again?
Yes, but once again, I'll be try to be quick. Let me just. Okay. Yes. Once again, very nice and stimulating comments. If we wanted to work on the concept of lexicon, I think we needed to, for example, avoid hyper-differentiation and specialization. Back to Popper, in the worst case, we should distinguish, sorry, among hard sciences, political and social sciences, and humanities. The more we are specific about, for example, the language of chemistry, the language of economics, the language of law, the language of physics, the more we will be specific with the terms of the lexicon, the more it will not work.
Yes.
It is my training and my education. I will be brief about my biographies. I will not tell you my life. Don't worry. My biography, very quick, is the one of a sociologist. And in general, the gist of law, legal studies. When I was at the very beginning of my academic studies, Nicholas Luhmann, I used to come to Bologna, where I was a student, and I had the chance to, I don't say working because it would be false, but studying and learning directing from his seminars and conferences. Also because I'm lucky enough to have also German roots, and I also speak German a little bit. So I could understand also some terms, philosophically speaking, you know, which were more specific than the English translation. What I'm saying is that, very briefly, when we work in lawmaking, which is a typical work for systemic thinkers in sociology of law, Luhmann began as a sociologist of law. his theory began as a theory of differentiation of law, and then he moved on. When you work about law, you work about a structural coupling with politics sometimes, a kind of illusion of a double bind in which you expect politics to shape what law will formalize, as if law were a kind of mathematics among social sciences. And it's not exactly so. It's not like that. For example, consider the debate about the rights of gays, lesbians, transgender, and whatever. Whatever you think about it politically, if you need to have a wider range of rights, you don't need a more specific legal lexicon. You need a more general epistemological and legal concept. For example, you don't need to create special laws and regulations if the couple is made of 2 women, 2 men, a man who was a woman who was a man, and so forth. You don't need to specify this. You just need to write an article in a law which states that the marriage is based on the couple, full stop. You need to generalize, not to specify, not to differentiate. So the more, if the lexicon is a tool to link more general concepts to more general terms, lexicon can be paradise. If lexicon begins to cut everything in smaller and smaller species, lexicon will be a disaster. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Very true. Now,
Thank you.
Gerard and Lucas, we haven't heard from you, so perhaps.
Oh, sorry.
First, Andrea, I completely agree with your last statement about the cutting up. That is the end of that's the worst case thing to do. But having said that, Gerard or Lucas, we haven't heard from you. Gerard, do you have any comments?
Not really, for 2 reasons. One is I haven't read the chapter, so I feel a little bit out of the discussion. But on the other hand, a number of the issues that came up are very interesting to me. One of the things that one of the issues that was raised in my mind is that I couldn't actually make a good distinction between 2 types of things. One is, we can say, for example, I make a distinction, or we can say the fact that I point to a distinction in my environment makes it possible for me to think about distinctions. So in that sense, I'm still at a very primitive level, and therefore I prefer to listen. Sorry.
I would like to make at least one more comment, since I I also enjoy listening, but I also perhaps say too much sometimes. But I think the situation that Andreas has raised with regard to how fine do you dice things up when you're communicating is really a very, very, very important issue. Now, my training and experience comes, much of it at the interface between government regulations, that is law, and the enforcement of laws, and the practice of medicine, and or the notion of human health and how it's influenced by the environment. And in this case, the regulations that are necessary for social safety and health or social risk analysis or whatever you want to terminology, whatever lexicon you choose there. But the basic idea is that the idea of health regulations are to protect the general population. It's part of the community activity, the social structure. And of course, the virus pandemic has illustrated this beyond belief in terms of the importance of appropriate regulations to protect the general population. So how finely you dice depends a great deal on which social problem or social issue you're trying to address. And when it comes to the, shall we say, the variants of the coronavirus, how finely diced is that language? How the lexicon for the coronavirus, which was almost zero, it didn't even have a name when it escaped, to now one is talking about at least 1,000 different variants in the lexicon of the coronavirus. And all of this has come about in 2 or 3 years. So yeah, this issue of lexicon is a very complicated one. And for some purposes, like sexual relationships between human beings, you may want a very, very crude lexicon, such that you don't really address the basic issues. You just allow the political system to operate within that lexicon. And that is all that is needed in that case. Of course, it doesn't solve the political problem at all. It just says, well, that's what we're going to call law. You cannot do that with the coronavirus. You cannot, you simply, the factual nature of the situation is, it's there, and you have to cope with it in some fashion or another. Whether you do that by metaphor, by belief systems about the value of different medicines, whether you deal with it with regulations or you deal with it with lockdown, these are all political issues seeking to address the nature of the coronavirus and human pandemics. I stopped there.
Okay,
All right.
I think it's approaching time to stop. Just very quickly then, can I turn to our last 2 speakers just to sum up very, very quickly? So
Yes.
just starting Jamie.
Yeah. So I want to follow up with what Andrea said about cutting up smaller and smaller distinctions. When you read George Spencer Brown, the first 3 pages, he points out the 3 metaphors that we use while talking about the distinction. This one is the cleavage that I hear a lot. That is that you cut up, that's Plato's butcher, cutting nature at the joint, so to say. And then the 2 others are the circle in the sand, and then the container metaphor when he says distinction is perfect continence. As I understand it, since we have been talking about lexicons and the value if Lud would have somewhere a lexicon, when we read George Spencer Brown's book, it can be read in 3 different manners, pointing out 3 different types of lexicons. One lexicon is about human communication, communicating with each other. So that's in the midst of us communicating that we try to develop the lexicon. But then the 2 others are machine language. It is when you design a machine to do what it is supposed to do. This is a very different lexicon. And then the 3rd one are logics. Dus that are the logicians who come up with rules to work with symbols to understand the property of the rules. And so George Spencer Brown is using the distinction, and he actually is developing this a lexicon for the logician who wants to work with the distinction. But he can also be read as designing a machine language, but then he's actually also communicating with other humans, and you see that in chapter 3. And so what I'm trying to say, there is hope for a lexicon, that we need to make sure we're not developing a machine language lexicon, that we're actually developing a human communication lexicon, and that we also just do not hold the logicians hostage when they try to do their novelty logics that can actually have very significant contributions for society. So so in the spirit of that, I think that Loot is trying to contribute to the lexicon of humans communicating with each other in the midst of a communication. And thanks to you, Andrea, I understand better. So Loot is criticizing human, but it's not exactly identifying yet with George Gregory Bateson. So it's somewhere in the middle. Okay.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry,
Andrea?
Andrea. Yeah.
May I?
Yes. Closing words to you.
Yeah, very closing word about a very short one. Linking to, I think, Jason, the gentleman quoting the COVID.
Gary.
As a sociologist, I want to emphasize why I was focused much more on epistemology than on data, also in Let's book. Because at the moment, I'm talking as a sociologist, not as a doctor in medicine. I'm not a biologist, I'm not a doctor in medicine, so I don't talk about the health side. We have a gigantic amount of useless data about COVID. Because we have a gigantic amount of data, including about deaths, people who died for COVID, and they are totally unreliable. Why? Because at the beginning, the pandemic generated, of course, a high risk and high emergency reaction. That's normal. That's but in my opinion, what didn't work at the very beginning also was that the World Health Organization should have conceptualized, categorized, and classified immediately the concept of death by COVID. It didn't work like that. So in every state, in every region, in every municipality, in every hospital, when a person died, they, in a certain way, creatively classified that person. So for example, if you were a man in his late 90s with 2 ictus, a liver cancer, and COVID, in Germany, the death cause was classified as age, because this man was 95, for example. In Italy, the same exact case, a man of 95 with a liver cancer, with 2 heart attacks and COVID, was classified as a death by COVID. So counting the deaths of COVID, the policy modeling and the social and political management of health, not the medical one, and also the media representation of the risk was based on data which had no reason to live, to exist.
Yeah.
So that's why epistemology wins on empirical data, because if you are wrong in conceptualizing and then in classifying and so forth, and then in setting the indexicals, then the outcome, the variable, is the result not of the scenario, is the result of your construction. So that's why I think also in Let's book, the focus, that's my opinion, of course, should be much more on the epistemological framework he provides than the technical, mathematical data aspects. That's it.
Okay, all right. That's a very powerful example, and thank you so much for both contributions. What's the next session, Jamie? We're on to chapter 9. You're muted, I think.
Jamie?
Yeah, okay. I need to look at my notes and I hope to find them. Actually, I don't have them with me. I don't recall. So the next Gerard, I believe you will be commenting in June. Is that correct?
The only thing I know is I'm chapter 10.
You're chapter 10, so you are in July.
Yes.
All right, so let me find the email. So okay, this is all going a little slow.
I wish it was.
I'm looking.
Please, Jamie, sorry.
Yeah.
It's
yeah, I found. Go ahead. I found the correct. So the next session is June 15, chapter 9, subdynamics in knowledge-based systems. And we get comments from Igone Portegomez from the University de Deusto from Spain, Engineering and Organization, and then also Caroline Wagner from Ohio State Public Affairs. And then there will be 2 more sessions in July, the 20th. Dat is Christian Gebhardt and Gerard de Zeeuw. That's on cultural and biological evolution. And then we have the closing chapter in August. And at the moment, I have Jerome down as a contributor, as a discussant. But there may be other people also joining. All
okay.
right, so
All right,
I
so
made
If I may,
yeah,
go ahead. Excuse me. Mark, would you do the closing comments, the final comments?
What in August?
No, no. What I'm trying to.
Oh, what today? Yeah. Okay. No, this is great. So thank you ever so much. I think this is a very interesting chapter. I think it is ambitious, and I think it's really it's exposed something among ourselves, which has been very interesting today. So so thank you for that, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
I'm going to follow Andrea's advice and go outside now. Enjoy the nice weather. Bye.
excuse me?
I said I'm going outside.
Yeah.
Thank you for the discussion.
All right. Thank you. Okay. Bye bye.
Thank you very much. I wish I can attend also the further events. Because, for example, chapter 7, while you were discussing it, I was opening the conference in Lisbon.
Yes.
So I had bad luck because it was the same day.
I know.
So I hope to attend also the further meetings, and thank you very much, everybody, for your patience and attention to my contribution. Thank you very much. I'm very open to further dialogues, conversations, and projects. So please just let me know.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Bye bye. Bye bye.
Very much. Bye bye.
Bye bye.